Hey everyone, you're listening to Sacred and Profane Love, a podcast in which philosophers, theologians, and literary critics discuss how literature can help us think more deeply about love, happiness, and meaning in human life. I am your host, Jennifer Frey. I am an associate professor of philosophy at the University of South Carolina. You can follow me on social media. I'm on Twitter at Jen Frey, and I'm also on Instagram at Professoressa Frey. You can also follow the podcast on Twitter at EudaimoniaPod. In this episode, I speak with the writer Nick Ripatrazone about the poetry of Gerard Manley Hopkins. I hope you enjoy our conversation. Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of Sacred and Profane Love. I'm really happy to be joined this morning by Nick Ripatrazone, who is the culture editor for Image Journal and also a contributing editor at The Millions and a columnist for Literary Hub. He's also the author of Longing for an Absent God and a new book, which is called Wild Belief, Poets and Prophets in the Wilderness. Welcome to the podcast, Nick.
Thank you for having me. Great to be here.
Yeah, well, I'm really excited because we're going to be doing another episode on poetry, which is really fantastic. But I'm also just excited about your book, which I just recently read, and I really loved it. It's really intriguing. Before we get into your book, I want to kind of start with you because I only internet know you. And so when you internet know somebody, you're just like making a bunch of inferences about them, some good, some bad. But you're a writer, obviously, and an editor, but you also teach, is it high school?
Yeah, I have been a high school English teacher I'll start my 18th year in the fall. I had taught college at the same time for my first, 10 or 11 years. So I was an adjunct at the College of New Jersey and at Rutgers.
Okay.
But yeah, my full-time job is a high school English teacher.
Okay. So, yeah, I mean, is it, I mean, I don't mean, to be dense or something or to make assumptions, but I just assume that someone who is a professional writer and a high school English teacher, that's not common, or is that super common?
I haven't experienced it being usually when people in my kind of professional life as a writer find out I teach high school, they think I'm either joking or they just are really confused. And at literary events, I have to kind of explain to them that, yeah, I'm actually a high school teacher. Like that's what I do during the day. I like the oddity and kind of the novelty of it. It is a good way to kind of get into talking about education, but it's a job that's definitely not for everyone. Neither is it for most, I would say, writers, which is probably the source of their confusion. So when I say I am, a high school teacher, but it is my I guess you can call it vocation or life or my work.
It's your day job, right?
Yeah, it very much is.
And so it must make you a very disciplined writer because, right? I mean, because how do you find the time? That's really my question.
Yeah, I've always been a person who's been kind of, I guess, obsessively driven to do the things that I want to do. And I guess writing, it filled the place of at some point in my life, sports. When I got injured as a basketball player in college, I just started to write and I never looked back from that point. And high school teaching, when you do it for long enough, I think you get into a certain rhythm and you understand what makes effective teaching, hopefully, and you understand what's in the best interest of the kids. Mm-hmm. And it's not loads of work. It's not endless, kind of repetitive, rote instruction. It's empathy and it's really understanding the kids. And when you get into that rhythm, I think the time in your life opens up a little bit. Mm-hmm. And I've always been someone who's inclined to write at night. In the summer, I do have a little more time to do that during other times of the day. But, I still have a family and have twins who, I want to be with them during the day. So it is a juggling act. But I would say that high school teaching ended up being an unlikely but almost perfect match for me. And I lucked out and was kind of blessed in that marriage of things.
Yeah. So what inspired you to write this book? What turned you in that direction?
Well, on a typical day, for example, today, after we talk, I'll go pick up my daughters at soccer camp, and then I'll go for a run in the woods. And hopefully it doesn't thunderstorm on me as it's supposed to today. But what a run in the woods means for me is I go down in New Jersey, there were a lot of abandoned railroads. So in the 1950s or so, they ripped up the railroads and kind of put the railroads and the ties and all that stuff on the side, and they turned them into running trails and walking trails. So they kind of crisscross Northwest New Jersey. And when you run in the woods, sometimes you're running behind people's houses, but a lot of times you're running in the past kind of through these long corridors of forest with the trees kind of as the canopy over you. So I spent a lot of time out in the woods, and behind our house is a forest, and we sort of kind of find our way back there a lot, going through the creek, and we have wildlife cameras set up all over the place. So we have coyotes and bobcats and bears and everything you can imagine come through here. So it's not the New Jersey that I grew up with, nor is it the New Jersey that people think of when they think of New Jersey. So what I found was that I was continually drawn to that almost paradox of place, that I'm from a place that people don't associate with the wild. But I have come to learn that the wild finds us, I guess, whether or not we choose to seek it out. So for me, when I'm out running or when I'm out behind our house, with my daughters, that tends to be a place that conjures kind of spiritual thoughts for me. And I've always been a Catholic, and I'm always going to be a Catholic. That's just who I am. So for me, Catholicism has been very much a wild belief system. And I mean that both in like the wilderness sense, but also, when I say to you that when people find out I'm a high school teacher, they're like, what the hell is that? When they find out that I'm like a Catholic writer, they're like, what the hell is that? Like it's to me, like I said, because I've always been that, it's not surprising, but to other people in the secular world, and a lot of times also in other elements of publishing, it's somewhat of a conundrum. That that is my identity.
Right.
So the wild in that way has felt it's challenged me, but it's also received me, and it felt like the right time in my life to write a book about that tradition and how it affects me, but how it's affected storytellers over the years.
Okay, so let's talk about what you mean by the wild and wilderness, and how that kind of sets the stage for your book.
So the wilderness, I take a pretty big view of what that could mean. At points in the book, I do talk about the biblical wilderness. I talk about the idea of the desert as almost a proving ground for faith, as a baptismal location. But I also believe that the wilderness, kind of following Wendell Berry, is the edge of a asphalt parking lot that's overgrown with weeds. It's the small strip of forest that separates two people's homes. The wilderness, and I think this is one of my main kind of points in the book, is that the wilderness, if it's only a place that we kind of pack up the car and travel to maybe 2 times a year, it's separate from us. We don't work to conserve it. We don't see it as a spiritual, a place of almost generative kind of spirituality. We have to recognize that the wilderness it was here before us. It's going to be here when we're gone. It's a great place for us to understand God. And the people that I talk about in the book, I start off with John the Baptist, I talk about Jesus, I talk about the Desert Fathers, specifically St. Anthony. But then I go into more contemporary writers, people like Jim Harrison, Thomas McGuane, W.S. Merwin, Mary Oliver, all the way on to Toni Morrison, people who I feel have been influenced by the wilderness in different ways. And I was hoping that people would see, even though I'm approaching this as a Catholic writer, not all the people in the book are Catholic. I would say it probably leans in the direction of Catholicism, but it's broader than that. It's looking at how the wilderness has created spirituality in many different faith traditions.
Right. Well, and there's also kind of a secular analog. So this is something that, in my academic research, I do a lot of work on self-transcendence, and I've done a lot of work with social scientists, especially psychologists who are working on this concept. And all of the social scientific literature on awe and like what they call epiphatic like experiences, where they talk about oceanic feelings and a sense of oneness with everything. Basically, being out in the wild is the second best way to get this. The first way is to pray. But if you don't do that, then just going out into what John Muir called, what did he call them? Natural cathedrals. You have this sense of an overwhelming feeling of awe in the face of not just nature, but a nature that is, in very important and deep ways, untouched by the will of man.
Yeah.
Right? So it's not nature that's been corralled or controlled or manipulated in ways that are useful to us. It's kind of like useless nature.
Mm-hmm.
It's just there. It's itself in a way. And if it's expressive of a will, it's not ours, right? Yeah. Maybe it's not expressive of a will at all, but it's just something that is completely separate from us. Also, people describe these experiences that they have out in the wilderness as experiences of tremendous beauty, and it has this kind of quasi-religious character to it, So even the completely secular empirical literature on this tends to reach for words like the sacred, and so I've always found that just incredibly interesting. There's also a lot of work that's trying to show or purports to show, again, from an empirical standpoint, that there is some kind of salutary, moral, spiritual effect of these experiences. Now, they don't necessarily last, right? So they don't translate into, because of course you leave, right? And your oceanic feelings don't last, So I think there's something, I think that there's something to this that even completely secular people and completely secular methodologies are kind of attuned to.
I love that you brought that up. And I like that phrase that you use, like the idea of the useless wilderness, because I think a lot of times we conceive of the natural world through the egoistic kind of human view. What can it do for us? I'm saying this as I'm hearing lawns being mowed in the distance, and like you understand the upkeep that is necessary almost to have a home or to have a space, but at the same time, the egotistical inclination to control.
The libido dominandi.
Right. So if you bring up, as you say, like the people for whom religion is not their methodological or their interest, it is, they still lean in that direction when they talk about the natural world. And I think Father, I think it was Father Thomas Berry who was writing about this and saying that the conservation movement needs God to truly be a steward movement. If it's agnostic, if it's atheistic, it doesn't go all the way that it should go in terms of the sacral elements. And so I'm actually happy to hear, as you're saying, that there's empirically are leaning in that direction. I think a lot of the people that I've encountered who have been environmentally inclined, we could say, have also had that open-minded nature about God. And it's without it, it feels empty. It feels inauthentic. And what you talk when you talk about these idea of these moments of awe, I am one of the least sentimental people that I know. I mean, I'm an Italian person from New Jersey. So like this is, you've got like the skeptic of all skeptics here. And I'm saying that when I go out in the wild, that's the place that changes me. And, it's either the wild or it's at mass. Those are the two places that I'm sentimental. And to have them come together in the woods, it feels like there's something happening there. And, I that's what I sort of want to look at in the book.
Yeah. So you say at the end of, I can't remember if it's your preface or your introduction, but somewhere you say that we need the tonic of wilderness. What do you mean by that? I
think we need to be jarred out of a sense of complacency, a sense of the typical. And, I go back to Wendell Berry because Wendell Berry was careful to laud the domestic as much as he held up the wild. He didn't want to say that domestic life is or the ordinary or the prosaic is not interesting. But there is a necessity, I think, to be kind of jarred out of that comfort that we have. And, when I go back to online existence, of which, we've had an increasing amount perhaps in the past year and a half, but still it was something that was with us before. And I think of the almost literal tunnel vision of being online and that feeling of the constant cycling of information and being part of that circuit sort of world. When I see a bear out, and that happens to us all the time. It happened to us 3 days ago outside. I was outside with my daughters and the bear just walks up. Like that shocks us that we are not the most important thing in the universe. There are other things beyond us that we don't understand that are grander than us. And it's that little fissure, I guess, in the complacency that awakens us. So the tonic of the wild is the idea that we need to go out there. We need to experience that world. We need to understand that the world that we live every day is comfortable. Perhaps it's what we create the structure, but it's not the full world. And as storytellers throughout, the Christian tradition, but even beyond the Christian tradition have seen, is that the wilderness shakes us a little bit. And it's good to feel that, I think.
Yeah. Well, it's also, I don't know I'm not sure if you want to pick up this thread or not, but the wilderness is also terrifying, right? So I'm scared of bears. I don't know about you. I don't really want a pet bear. But I was raised in a totally secular, borderline atheist household. But my parents were also kind of like hippies, and all of our vacations were going to national parks or state parks. Like that's what we did. We just got out there. My parents made me hike the Grand Canyon when I was 7. Just do it, and you're like, I think I might die. They're like, no, it's fun. And so, we would be out in Glacier or Yellowstone, and my parents, and I've seen my dad get chased by bison, and I'm like, oh, it seems bad. But it's also kind of terrifying because you realize one false step here and I'm a goner, right? That's just a sheer cliff. Yeah. Right. Less than a foot away from me. There's no guardrail. And my parents were very, I'm just very Gen X, and they were still of that generation where they were like, yeah, you might die. And I'm not going to try to protect you from that. And I think actually that was good. It was terrifying to me at the time. But I think it was good, right? Yeah. Because it did, they didn't have to teach me that it was implicitly this giant memento mori, you're a fragile thing.
Yeah.
this grizzly bear, if it comes, it'll probably eat you. So here's what you got to do to try to stave that off. Yeah, we're out in grizzly territory.
Yeah.
Because we think it's cool.
Right.
I just wonder if you, I mean, I think a lot of people now would think that's bad parenting. One, I mean, I've had people call the cops on me because I let my kids walk to school by themselves.
Oh,
There's this kind of hyper, there's this idea that what good parenting is sheltering your kids, right? Whether it's sheltering them from beliefs that you don't hold or just sheltering them from any kind of physical harm, right? And I didn't grow up in that cultural space. You know, all of the playgrounds were still incredibly dangerous and we got hurt all the time.
Right.
But yeah, I just wonder if is there a part of like the danger aspect that you're interested in as having any kind of spiritual?
Absolutely. I think the fact that has stayed with you for so long speaks to its power as a story, I guess. It was an experience, but it was a narrative, right? It was a story. You know, you're able to recall it. And as you say, it had some formative element for you. And I think, whenever I go run, I'm scared. And I'm not scared to the point that I stop running, but I know that something could cross my path. And I keep going. And I think, when Gustave Flaubert, who was certainly not known as a religious person, when he was drawn to St. Anthony and the life and the legend, of St. Anthony, and he became obsessed with, that was Flaubert's real true life work, was The Temptation of St. Anthony, his book that he worked on for many, many years. And he'd be walking around in kind of a reverie, thinking about, not the forest wilderness that we're talking about, but the desert wilderness. What drew him to that was the incredible fear of that narrative. The Temptation of St. Anthony, in many ways, is this extreme horror play in novel form. And we watched The Exorcist when we were way too young for other people, but in an Italian house, like The Exorcist, this is sort of like rite of passage. And to me, fear and religion can coexist. And I don't need to figure everything out. And I would be a little bit scared if I did. And I don't understand everything about the wild, which is part of why we call the wild. When we refer to things as wild, they are unkempt, they are natural, they are faster than us, stronger than us, they're beyond us. And I agree with you that element of fear can cultivate an awe, which could lead to belief, which could lead to faith. Because what do we do with that weird feeling of not knowing? It has to go somewhere. But I think, as you say, you're correct that people don't want to feel uncomfortable in that way.
Yeah. And I think that there's a real connection with humility. When you have these experiences and you realize, one, that everything's not about you, right? Like this has been here before you. This is going to be here way after you're gone. And also like that this could, this could kill you. And I think there is it's kind of forced humility, really. And I think that's good for people. I think humility is good. And for my parents, our vacations, they were a kind of education. Like that's what my parents thought. That was their catechesis for me. And what I came to see much later in life, somewhat to my parents' dismay, is that there is a suppressed premise there, right? Namely that nature is good, but it's beautiful. And well, then I thought about, okay, well, how can that be, right? and then I just became a papist. That was not the direction that education was meant to go in
Right.
at all.
Yeah.
But I think, it really did. It definitely shaped my mind and my heart in pretty profound ways.
Yeah.
But any education does.
Right.
And
But it sounds like there was a natural overlap once you came to that place, kind of religiously, that there was like you say, that the natural world made sense, perhaps, or maybe inevitably was what it should have been for you, for your life.
Yeah. Well, and I also think it taught me contemplation without giving a name for it. Right? Because like you're out there in a tent. I mean, there were no iPhones then.
Right.
You're just out there and you've got like a compass.
Right.
And of course I was a bookworm, so I always brought my books, but still you're just contemplating nature. You don't know that it's contemplation. Nobody gives you a framework for really thinking about it, but that's what you're doing.
Yeah.
And that obviously stuck with me as well. So I want to turn now to chapter 2 of your book, which is called Wild Creativity and is a chapter on Gerard Manley Hopkins, the great English Jesuit poet. So who was Hopkins, and why was Hopkins so important to English poetry?
Gerard Manley Hopkins, as you note, was a Jesuit priest. He was raised Anglican, and much to his mom's dismay, caught wind of the tradition of Catholic conversion that was happening at Oxford, which included John Henry Newman. And when he converted, it was the end of a process that had been happening to him for some years, and we can kind of trace that evolution in his journals. He did keep rather copious notebooks and journals, drawings and observations about nature, but also spiritual contemplation. So when Hopkins converted, things started to make sense for him, and he rather leaned very strongly into his faith, and ultimately became a Jesuit priest, was ordained, and continued that till his death. Hopkins is, to me, one of the most radical and important poets in the English language. And he has led to, I would say, a seismic shift in prosody, in syntax, in the way people, as writers, kind of express themselves. So I was introduced to Hopkins when I was an undergraduate. So I was at a Lutheran college, Susquehanna University in Pennsylvania, and I was being taught the writing of poetry by an agnostic professor. And she was the person who introduced me to Hopkins. So me, the Catholic, had no idea who Hopkins was when I was, a sophomore in college. But we read the Windhover in class. And here was someone who didn't believe in God, who talked about this as it was a holy text, and that he was the preeminent English poet. Hopkins is jarring. He is strange, and I mean that in the best possible way, because, as we kind of alluded to before, Catholicism is strange because it's radical. The idea of Christ is radical, especially in a secular world. So Hopkins, as a writer, sounded out of place. He sounded unusual. And so you have this guy who's just a very skilled writer, and at the same time, whose faith and whose sense of God is at the center of his poetry, and who says the name of Christ, who speaks of the Holy Ghost in his lines. So it's not someone for whom religion is a kind of distant influence. It's front and center in his work. And after him, I think there then became this kind of template for what a religious poet could be, because Hopkins embraced that idea, even though during his lifetime, really his work wasn't published. It wasn't really until he died and his friend Robert Bridges, who was at one point Poet Laureate of England, collected his work and released it to the world.
So what really is so different about his poetry compared to what came before it? Because presumably it wouldn't just be that he talks about God. Plenty of religious poetry before Hopkins. I mean, is it something about his style? Something about what he's doing with meter, or?
Hopkins had an extreme level of compression to his lines. He packs a lot of information, a lot of juxtaposed imagery. It's almost like it's like a kind of paper bowled up, and then like when it's like he's like strengthening it and he's like tightening it, and if you were to let it loose, like it would kind of explode. Like he has a sense of compression that other poets didn't have. In his poetry, what Hopkins would do is that, the Windhover is one example. That was the one, like I said, that sort of introduced me to him. Hopkins would have kind of an animating image. A Windhover is a wind hover, like a falcon that's kind of flying in the air, but it almost looks like they're stuck, where they're kind of riding the wind. And he would start with that image. And as a Jesuit, especially, he believed that God was in all things. So if you believe that God is in all things, God is in that falcon that's in the air above you. God is in the wind that is pushing against the falcon. God is in your perception of that falcon. So he would have that kind of extreme layering. And the question is, well, how do you show that in a poem? Now, you don't say, well, literally, God is in me, God is in the falcon. Like that doesn't work in art, right? To be that literal. So you have to ask yourself, well, how do you compress that into syntax? And that's the extreme compression that results in his work, which is why for some people, when they're introduced to Hopkins, he's tough to understand. And, if you look at sort of his work, I mean, I guess I could speak to one specifically, God's Grandeur.
Let's do it.
Yeah, the copy that I'm looking at now is my literal college copy, so the pages are falling out, which is, I guess, a sign of a good book. But God's Grandeur, I'll read a few lines from this. The world is charged with the grandeur of God. It will flame out like shining from shook foil. It gathers to a greatness like the ooze of oil crushed. Why do men then not wreck his rod? Generations have trod, and all is seared with trade, bleared, smeared with toil, and wears man's smudge, and shares man's smell. The soil is bare now, nor can foot feel being shod. And for all this, nature is never spent. There lives the dearest freshness, deep down things, and though the last lights off the black west went o' morning, as the brown brink eastward springs, because the Holy Ghost over the bent world broods with warm breast, and with bright wings. So if you're looking at that poem on the page, you see a large amount of punctuation. There are commas, there are semicolons, there's dashes. Hopkins believed that his work should be read aloud, that it should be heard. He said that in many of his letters to Robert Bridges. In that poem, when I talk about kind of the layering that he's doing, he starts with this kind of pronouncement line: the world is charged with the grandeur of God, which is one of those kind of abstract statements that, like you allude to, there's religious poets before him that have tried to show that. But the way that Hopkins shows it in his lines is through that juxtaposition, through that sense of sound, through almost the dirt, I guess, in the world that he looks at, to show us that even though we're kind of wearing down the world transcends us. God transcends us in many ways. And as you say before, it'll be there beyond we expire, beyond when we die.
Do you think it's challenging to read his poems aloud in the proper way, where like you're putting the proper stress on things and you're starting and stopping at the right spot?
I think punctuation is always going to be our best guide to reading a poem. I do think because of his tendency toward idiosyncrasy in his language, in his punning, in his usage or creation kind of out of whole cloth, new words from time to time, as he did in the Windhover, it could be challenging to find the right places to stress. A lot of Hopkins, a lot of his pieces were sonnets. So there's a natural question and answer, introduction, response rhythm to those texts. And sometimes that's the best way to approach Hopkins, is he kind of offers us situation and then explanation, or possibility and then result.
Mm-hmm. So what does you say? I mean, you argue in your book that his poetic gifts come from his vision of wilderness. So what is his vision of wilderness, and how does that kind of play out in his poems?
Yeah, Hopkins was always attracted to the natural world. When he would go on walks, either by himself or with friends, he would go back and write about those walks, the birds, the trees, the plants, the things that he saw. But as an artist, he had an artistic theory that is, once again, idiosyncratic. It's not a critical theory at all. So the ideas of inscape and in stress, I would always tell students and people that I wouldn't approach them as like a critical methodology, because Hopkins really wasn't a critic. He was an artist. And an artist needs to find a method for them to create things, not for them to assess things. So for Hopkins, the idea of inscape is kind of a concept of almost proportion, that everything in this world has unique and particular elements, a certain proportion to it. And he believed in a certain existence of patterns in nature. I mean, if you cut a tree, you'll see the pattern, of course. So Hopkins, he had this one great line in his journal where he says, if you look hard enough at something, it seems to look hard at you. And, it's an interesting line, because it almost implies that the natural world sees us. And I think that, to me, is at the heart of Hopkins' sense of the wilderness. There was a tree that was cut down near where Hopkins was once, and he wept over it. And this idea that he could be so hurt by the hurt world meant that he believed everything was a God-created gift. So if you think, if someone is, I always kind of tell this, to people when I talk about religion and writing, if people claim to be believers, and, someone like myself who believes in these things, we sometimes have to follow them to their logical ends, right? And if the belief is that God created all things, and God created nature, and God created the bear, but also the water, and God created the desert, and so on. If we believe that, then those are beautiful things. Those are things worth saving, worth respecting. But there are also things that affect us in ways that maybe are comforting, maybe are not. But for Hopkins, in this poem, God's Grandeur, when he says, despite our smearing with toil, our smudge, nature is never spent, that it will be beyond us because it was made not for us. And that's kind of the difficult pill to swallow sometimes with wilderness literature is that a lot of people like nature when they can control it, or they can deal with it in a way that is comforting to them. And Hopkins shows us that sometimes we have to be uncomfortable.
Yeah. What was his experience in the wild? I mean, is he like out there, I don't know, wrestling with bears or something? I mean, he's at Oxford for a long time. It's not exactly the wilderness.
Exactly, right.
It's quite lovely.
Maybe it's spiritual wilderness. But yeah, he certainly wrote about a spiritual wilderness. He was very drawn to Christ's temptation in the wilderness and the idea of being spiritually tested. So he used that metaphorical wilderness much. A lot of his time out in the wild, he did some traveling at some points in his life as part of the Jesuit order, but a lot of his time in the wild was in spaces where he could see, there's one poem that I love, in Verse Nade, where he's writing about seeing the water, and he describes it, this darksome burn, horseback brown, his roll rock high road roaring down in coupon and comb, the fleece of his foam, flutes and low to the lake falls home. He's describing both a horse and the water that appears like the horse. So for Hopkins, there was a connectivity to the wild that even if he was in a space that wasn't the preternatural or kind of stereotypical wilderness, it was all connected for him, which is, I think, a Catholic belief, in many ways. So we wouldn't consider Hopkins a John Muir kind of individual, somebody who's out there for months, but we do see him as somebody who was able to draw those metaphors out of the wild he was able to encounter.
Well, I do think Americans have their own culturally specific understanding of the wilderness, which is just baked into how we came to be and kind of manifest destiny. And, the whole idea of going west and going out into the wild, but it was all sort of tinged with conquering it. Right.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, that was sort of like the whole idea of there's a kind of masculinity tied up with all of that.
Oh, yeah.
Maybe it's not uniquely American, but it's definitely like a recognizably American thing. And then there's also just the fact that in America, for a variety of reasons, we have wilderness, right? That we specifically were like, we're going to basically put a fence around this.
Yeah.
And we're gonna conserve it, right? Yeah. And of course, John Muir and Teddy Roosevelt were a huge part of that. It's sort of amazing that happened. It's like it's a miracle, actually.
It is.
That someone was basically like, not everything can be for human use.
Right.
That any American president ever just bought into that. Right. Is still amazing to me. I'm like, we'll always have to fight for it. We'll always be under threat. So we're almost out of time. Maybe let's go through one or two of Hopkins' poems just to get a sense of how this is playing out. I mean, so we did God's Grandeur, and then, what is it? A verse nade? How do you say that?
In verse nade, yeah.
In verse nade. Is there another one you want to talk about?
I really love Pied Beauty.
Oh yeah, that's a great one. Which reminds me, by the way, is there an edition of Hopkins that you recommend for our listeners?
I have always used the old school Gardner one. I don't know if the Gardner has been repackaged in recent years. The W.H. Gardner Penguin edition. I've always used that one, but I think when Paul Mariani has done his biographies of Hopkins, that he's used possibly a different one, but I'm not sure the exact title of the other one.
The one I just have is Oxford World's Classics.
Got it. Okay.
Very cheap. Probably the Penguin is cheap too. I mean, look, it's in English. It's not like it's in translation. Exactly. So in some sense you can't go wrong. Exactly. Okay. So Pied Beauty, take it away.
Glory be to God for dappled things, for skies of couple color as a brinded cow, for rose moles all in stipple, upon trout that swim, fresh fire coal, chestnut foals, finches' wings, landscape plotted and pieced, fold, fallow, and plough, and all trades, their gear and tackle and trim. All things counter, original, spare, strange, whatever is fickle, freckled, who knows how, with swift, slow, sweet, sour, a dazzle dim, he fathers forth whose beauty is past change. Praise him. So I love this from start to finish. I love that he ends the poem, praise him. I love that he has a parenthetical note in the poem, who knows how, which is kind of at the core of faith, right? Like, I mean, talk about humility, you know, faith is an act of humility. Like, we're kind of saying, like, I think it's true, but I don't really know. Like, I mean, that's what powers Hopkins. In the poem, he once again starts with that pronouncement kind of opening line, right? Like God's grandeur. He says, glory be to God for dappled things. So one of our dogs is a dappled dachshund. You know, it has those marks. It kind of looks unusual. Hopkins is saying to us, in this world, we have things that are different. We have things that are odd. We have things that are uncomfortable, perhaps, to us. Those are God's creations. And, you know, when I talked about kind of that sonnet style of presentation and then response, in the first half of this sonnet, he's kind of listing all these different things, the cow, the trout. When you look, you know, he always has this bird's eye view of in England, the landscape in these little plots. He's saying these beautiful things have spots, right? And in the second half of the sonnet, you know, he even uses that word strange. Hopkins embraced that oddity in existence and thought that that's where God was. I think it's a beautiful piece. And I think one thing that's great about Hopkins is that he's a kind of poet who could be a spiritual kind of guide or companion for people. You know, if you don't know what to pray about or how to pray, read Pied Beauty and contemplate it. Right? I mean, that's like a spiritual guide that an artist can give us. I think what makes one of the reasons why Hopkins is such a great writer.
I mean, it's so interesting. So I agree. It's interesting to me, though, that you say that Hopkins is tough for people. There are some poets that I find really tough, but I can't say that Hopkins is one of them. I mean, to me, it's just very beautiful.
Yeah.
And I don't know whatever's holding people back. I mean, I don't find him, one, his poems are short for the most part. So it's not like some big, it's not like Dante, who I think is legit hard, but, you know, totally worth it. You know, I feel like Hopkins is just something that can be on your nightstand and, you know, just pick it up in the morning or in the evening before bed and just appreciate it. And yeah, definitely read it out loud. But I would say that for all poetry, right? Well, all poetry that's not in translation, I guess. Right. Because you have to hear it, you know, because it is kind of like a song. You wouldn't, nobody thinks you can appreciate a song by just looking at the lyrics. Right. I mean, most of the time you look at you, like you would not. Exactly. So you have to really have to speak it because just the sounds, the way that the sounds play off one another, it's so important. And it's so stunning in his poetry in particular. The way that I'm sorry because I don't have the technical jargon, but I'll just speak in my untutored philosophy sort of way. It just, you know, the way that the consonants and the vowels and it just sort of spills off your tongue. It's marvelous. Yeah. So I think people should definitely not be put off by Hopkins. Like, I actually don't think he's that hard. Maybe if I were more sophisticated, I would understand why this is so difficult. But I'm not. Like, I'm not trained in poetry.
Well, you know, I think you have an openness to God in a text, which I think helps, right?
Yeah.
Like if you read a poem, and I think that's perhaps one of the paradoxes of Hopkins is that people who love Hopkins tend to be people who are skilled agnostic poets who just love great prosody and syntax, and people who see God in all things. That's a pretty big. I mean, any writer would be lucky to have that wide of a swath of an audience, and that's what allows Hopkins to transcend. And I would echo what you say. If you're someone who, if someone has never really studied poetry before, read Spring and Fall by Gerard Manley Hopkins.
I really loved that one.
Yeah, you'll probably be really sad at the end, but it's a beautiful piece, and it can be approached by, I think, any reader.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Do you teach Hopkins?
I do.
Yeah. What are your high school kids think about it?
I am. My high school is like a mini Catholic education public school. I teach Hopkins. I teach the little Thomas Pynchon. It's
Don't get in trouble, Nick.
No, it's all good. I teach Hopkins to my AP language students because he is. If you can navigate his lines, you can get through anything. So I teach them 2RB, which was one of his, I think perhaps his last poem.
I think that was his last poem. Yeah. That was to his friend, Robert Bridges.
Correct.
Did I get that right? Yeah.
Yeah. Hopkins
who was an atheist? This was like his poet friend.
Yes. Yeah. Hopkins says, I write to convert you. And he literally kind of meant, to nudge.
Yeah, but it didn't work though, did it?
Not at all. Not at all. But we all need foils like that, I think. Yeah.
Yeah. So what about this poem, 2RB?
2RB, I mean, it's interesting because it's a poem where he kind of apologizes for his lack of creative output, but does so in this incredibly masterful poem. So ironically, he's creating his poem, but he creates this sense that he plays upon metaphors of pregnancy and gestation, this idea of an idea, 9 years, he says, in the body, like this concept of we have to sit with something for a long time. But with Hopkins, there's the idea that if we believe in God, and Hopkins certainly did, even if his life wasn't perfect and life wasn't easy for him and he suffered in his existence, he believed that there was something greater than him. And if you can write towards that as an artist, that's huge. And that's, I think, why so many wonderful artists have been, they've been religious. And when I say religious, piety is tough, but that's not really what religion is about. Religion is about the trying and the belief, right? And Hopkins had that in full.
Yeah, it's the struggle. Perseverance to the end. Well, why don't we end things on his last poem? Do you mind reading it?
Of course. Okay, so his last poem was titled 2RB. The fine delight that fathers thought, the strong spur, live and lancing like the blowpipe flame, breathes once, and quenched faster than it came, leaves yet the mind a mother of immortal song. 9 months she then, nay years, 9 years she long within her wears, bears cares and combs the same, the widow of an insight lost, she lives, with aim now known and hand at work now never wrong. Sweet fire, the sire of muse, my soul needs this. I want the one rapture of an inspiration. Oh, then, if in my lagging lines you miss the roll, the rise, the carol, the creation, my winter world that scarcely breathes that bliss, now yields you, with some sighs, our explanation.
I think he went out with a bang, frankly.
Yeah.
That's a wonderful poem. Thank you so much, Nick, for joining us. This was really fun.
Thank you for having me. It was great.
You have been listening to Sacred and Profane Love, a philosophy and theology podcast that is generously underwritten by the Institute of Human Ecology at the Catholic University of America and produced by Catholics for Hire, a group of young Catholic digital content freelancers. If you enjoy this podcast, please consider supporting us on Patreon. Just go to www.patreon.com/eudaimoniapod to become a monthly patron. And I'd like to thank our most recent patrons for their support of the podcast. So thanks go to Jeffrey Dargis, Joseph Trout, George Sankari, John Arnold, Mary Finnegan, Steve Lothis, Abby Rogers, John Butcher, Sean McGillernath, and Lawrence Bausch. For our next episode, I'll be joined by Michael Farmer to discuss the philosophy of Gabriel Marcel and his play Thirst. Until then, friends, be well and keep reading.